My paper's about working with tempo rhythm in screen acted training. And as part of my work as the program leader for the MA screen acting course at Salford and my teaching across the acting for camera strand on performance, it became apparent to me that there's generally a lack of familiarity with tempo and rhythm, and particularly physical skill work in the students that students seem to produce on camera in comparison to their stage work, right? So I inserted tempo rhythm as one facet of the acting for camera modules at levels 4 and 5 this year, which is first and second year undergrads. And this paper reflects on those experiences and highlights certain considerations arising from the application of the technique within a contemporary screen actor training context. So the modules attempt to replicate a professional model using different scripts each week with very little rehearsal and shooting to a tight schedule. Each week a new script is prepared by the student and forms the basis for exploring a different technique. So we used a 3 multi-camera setup working with a live edit feed, which is run from an adjacent gallery by the technicians. And this allows for a quick and dynamic system to use in class as a live and almost instant recorded playback system for reflection and discussion. The chosen scripts for the 2 cohorts in this instance were from BBC's The Responder Series 1, Episode 2, and Netflix Sex Education Series 1, Episode 1. And those scripts were chosen for their casting in terms of age and character, resonance with the student cohort, and because they included appropriate use of physical action and marked changes of tempo and rhythm in the scenes selected. Students' experiences of working with the technique were discussed in class reflections, and the scenes, the edit of the scenes as broadcast on TV were analysed alongside the students' work to make comparisons and further reflections. So their emotions and experiences, both as actor and as character within the scene, were fundamental to identifying how they might engage with the technique to best suit their individual needs. As Ilon Morris notes, there are a variety of interpretations around the distinction between tempo and rhythm in relation to the technique across the academy and acting teachers. But invariably, these centre around the speed, intensity and patterns of actions, and are all concerned with internal and external elements in individual characterisation and of the overall scene and production. So for the purposes of this paper, I'm going to lean on John Benedetti's interpretation, which denotes tempo as the speed of an action or feeling, and rhythm as the intensity of emotion and the pattern of gestures, moves and actions. So rooted in the psychophysical approach to the work, tempo rhythm is connected to the method of physical action. And one of the challenges trainee actors often face in developing work for screen is a perceived general lack of freedom in movement offered by the medium as opposed to stage. And despite some research into screen acting and the advocation of a physical action-based method by scholars such as Evie, many approaches to actor training on screen advise the actor to restrict movement or adapt its execution to accommodate some of the technical elements of shooting. So Emmy award-winning film and TV producer Professor Robert Benedetti advises actors to use movement only when absolutely necessary and to reduce the range and speed of that movement in order to suit the camera more and become easier to photograph. Director Patrick Tucker advises that if in motion, the actor should move slowly but speak quickly to allow the camera to capture the image more clearly, but without the sense that the scene is slowing down. Both of them advocate adapting the range of physical action to suit the shot size. So this suggests that the screen actor has to operate tempo rhythm on a variety of different levels, not only internal and external, but also contrasting physical with verbal and finding rhythms of action within a reduced frame. So when we were shooting the scene from Sex Education, many of the students' external movements of both Adam and Eric, full of the dramatic tension, aggression and fear inherent in the given circumstances of the scene, were executed at a tempo that looked convincing when watching them perform on set, but read as just too quick and imprecise for the screen medium close-up shot or the medium shot that we were using at a different time when watching it back. The camera capture somehow seemed to speed up the movement just a bit, and the violent rhythms were too amplified. So we worked on slowing the tempo of the movement to find more control. We used a metronome to impose various tempos on external movement to see how that transmitted on the screen, adjusted the shot sizes and the range of movement from macro to micro as we went to match. As Adam took various elements of Eric's belongings, tempo rhythms needed to adjust accordingly to our range of movement as well. And the problem the students encountered was this inevitably impacted them creatively, internally, and they felt the general sense of danger in the scene had become lost. So we watched the broadcast scene to help, and that edit. And we noticed that the movements of Adam, played by Connor Swindells, beyond the initial sudden element of his ambush, are mostly executed in a much slower, smoother fashion that suggests a sensuality in his relationship with Eric, played by Ncuti Gatwa, which foregrounds his later character development. And what is very noticeable are the shifts in accented movement from both actors to create a rhythm which maintains the danger, as well as the camera movement and the music that are affected in the edit after post-production. So this example identified how the actors could align an imposed element of external tempo within character background and situation, and they could sustain dramatic intensity through changes of rhythm in the movement despite a reduction in tempo overall. So director Tony Barr writes that it is change that is most apparent to an audience or viewer. Rhythmic change is clearly and immediately evident. That's Barr, 1997, page 99. From a psychophysical perspective, obviously an adjustment in tempo rhythm of external movement will inevitably impact upon emotional response. A technical imposition is at odds with an internal creative approach to the technique, or the sense of the correct tempo for the character and situation. It demands instead a compromise between technical requirements and creative choices. It's an outside-in approach, but from a very practical starting point. And in order to execute that technique, the trainee screen actor must develop great physical control and find great creative justification and stimulus. When we move to exploring internal tempo and rhythm, the technique had no constraints on it imposed by the camera setups, and the actor was able to have full agency over their creative impulses. So we still explored a variety of tempo rhythms to investigate the scenes in an active way. And the emotional responses of the students were very marked as we worked with extreme tempos in order to explore the effect. So, for example, in the responder scene where one character is very high on drugs and the other is betraying them without their knowledge, I set the internal tempo at 184 beats per minute for both characters, whilst asking them to maintain a relative stillness externally in order to keep within the scene blocking and the frame. On screen, the results were engaging, full of subtext and atmosphere without any post-production elements. Inevitably, the internal impacted upon the external and resulted in some nervous movements, twitches, tics that were consistent with the drug-addicted bodies and nervous systems of the two characters, but did make the frame appear a little bit too busy on screen. When we slowed the metronome down to less than 60 beats per minute, the students' perception on set was that the scene was slow and boring. And yet the results, again, read quite naturally on screen. The extremely slow tempo set, contrary to the actor's subjective experiences, did not read as boring or indeed very slow at all. External movements appeared fairly natural in rhythm and tempo, consistent perhaps with the tired nature of the two protagonists, and certainly not unnaturally slow. But it also created more moments of stillness, and that allowed the camera to capture the internal thought process and emotions of the characters more easily. And British actor Jason Watkins highlights that for TV and film, the rhythm of thoughts rather than words is what is most crucial to the actor. We compared their performances to the scene broadcast and found some consistencies, but significant differences in how long the camera stayed on each character without dialogue. In the broadcast, the first half of the scene alone takes 1 minute and 30 seconds and includes a 50-second section of no dialogue at all, cutting only between the two actors, Josh Finnan and Emily Fenn's faces. The rhythm is supported by the music and the edit, but of course these are absent in the shooting. My students played it at an average of 30 seconds a total, a third of the time. The scene is slow in the production, and the lingering shots show the dilemma of Marco's character and Casey's vulnerability, but it indicates how little of the tempo rhythm was evident in the students' initial script reading. The script gives an unusual amount of detailed directions of how Marco looks at Casey, then around the flat as he closes his eyes and struggles with his dilemma. The attention given to it in the text suggests much more emphasis on non-verbal action and gives some indication of the rhythm intended by the director. What was noticeable here was the subjective experience of time and tempo for the actors was significantly different to the objective time or subjective experience of tempo as the viewer. When I set an extremely fast internal tempo rhythm, it caused a great deal of anxiety with the actors in the scene. First year actors particularly reported feeling stressed. They didn't like working at that tempo internally. And the extremely slow pace made many feel like it was dull and boring, although some felt very comfortable. Obviously, subjective experiences differ according to social cultural factors and individuals. The impact of the subjective perception of time as well was evident in the final shot of the sex education scene. So after the bullying in the Netflix production, the camera stays on Eric for 20 seconds. Although the camera is moving, there is no text. The script, though, unlike Responder, gives no indication of this attention, giving one line of action written, and it simply says, Eric takes a deep breath and heads into his classroom. Ncuti Gatwa manages to convey a whole range of emotions and experiences in that time, mostly evident in micro movements of his face and eyes and a variety of rhythmic changes that are evident. And when exploring the scene for themselves, students struggled enormously to find active stillness for even a fraction of that time. I always give a bit of time before calling cut for that final moment of relaxation. And in those moments of non-dialogue, the perceptions from students were that they had waited sometimes as much as 3 times as long before I actually did that. So finding tempo rhythm in stillness and in silence therefore became a crucial part of our work and application, although I would argue there's very rarely, if ever, stillness on camera. There's always micro movements of the eyes and face as thoughts and feelings bubble to the surface. Complete stillness means tension usually comes from unengaged, anxious actors. Finding rhythms for minute physical actions in the eyes and face is what we needed to master, and for these to be driven by the internal. So the internal tempo rhythm remained our truthful route. And because we were using a scene with Ncuti Gatwa, I invoked Doctor Who in the class. And I talk about, interestingly, it's already been mentioned today, how we might manipulate time and space in front of the camera, how we can compress space due to the restrictions of the frame, and how we can stretch time to align our subjective experience of on-camera time with how it looks on screen. And often with these students, it's about extending that outer rhythm, finding more pause and changes, filling silence while maintaining that inner tempo rhythm. Bella Merlin mentions first night phenomenon, where the actor's tempo rhythm is at odds with the characters. On set, for the new actor, it's almost always first night. You might get a few takes, but the screen actor is required to deliver there and then with very little time to rehearse or to ease into the performance through a 3-week run. The tempo rhythm might shift dramatically from one shot to the next, as the shoot is often out of sequence, and so a firm mastery of the technique is required to flip between potential extremes so rapidly. And the practice of extending and stretching tempo rhythm can help control that void between actor and character. So turning our attentions to the overall tempo rhythm of the scene was an important part of the work we did in class. And I wanted to incorporate the edit. So the things that are outside the agency of the actor, we decided to take back. So unlike the stage where the actor has full agency, that agency is lost in the edit room, where the ultimate pacing and rhythm of the scene is finally determined. Because our setup facilitated it, we decided to explore the edit as part of our explorations into tempo rhythm. So each acting pair were encouraged to sit in the gallery and to live edit the scenes of their peers under the guidance of the gallery technician. The process was simplified for them. So actor editors were simply cutting between camera 1 and camera 2, usually a medium close-up or close-up of the 2 individual actors in the duologue. All they had to do was press one button every time they wanted to switch between cameras. And this edit would play back live onto the screen in the studio where the rest of the class were viewing. And it allowed them to get a sense of how the rhythm of the scene was working. And as they became used to the changes in pacing and rhythm of dialogue and any action delivered by the actors, They also began to identify key moments on the script which needed accentuating further, moments of tension or revelation that demanded a lingering shot or a quick cut to find a reaction from the listening actor, moments where the pace of the scene appeared a little slow or more usually too fast for the editor to cut to or to find a reaction shot at all. And when they returned to the set and performed their scene again, their sense of rhythm and tempo for the scene had changed, becoming far more informed. Whilst we reflect in class by playback all the time to consider these things, engaging students in a live editing process allowed them to actively investigate with their fellow actors. Collaborating on the final product to produce and edit live allowed them to get a greater sense of how it connected as a whole. And once again, the tempo of the scenes was often too quick. The actors started to plow on with the dialogue much too quickly. Whilst it's important not to let the scene drag too much, allowing time for that reaction before speech was of real benefit in the editing suite. And it was very evident to the actor editors who were exploring. So it often meant they needed to find more pause between dialogue, easing off an external tempo rather than drive language, find physical action or thought, and extend their sense of timing. The actors' editors found that engagement in that simplistic editing process helped them to feel the tempo rhythm of the scene and discover their own sense of what that might or should be when they return to their role as actors beyond simple textual analysis. So just to sum up, tempo rhythm still has a very important role to play in screen work in terms of character, emotion, inducing creative response. But if anything, I would argue a stronger mastery of the technique is required to adapt to technical constraints of the medium. Not only is it necessary to adapt the range of physical movement for varying sizes of shot, we must often also adapt the tempo of said movement to allow for camera to capture it. The mediation or translation of movement to screen through camera needs to be considered, and this further complicates the relationship between inner and outer. The inner can become truthful, psychological, emotional root and center if outer has to be strictly controlled. The inner intensity can resonate through the body and provide a focus for a controlled but relaxed outer expression, often through micro expression for close shots, particularly in relation to final reaction shots and non-verbal elements. Rhythms of thought are often more important than the rhythm of words, and changes of rhythm can sustain dramatic tension and communicate ideas to the viewer immediately and clearly. As a tool for encouraging training actors to explore tempo rhythm, the notion of extending or stretching time can help to align their own tempo rhythms with that of the character for the camera. A multi-camera approach with training actors involved in live editing can provide a good training tool to explore the tempo rhythm of the scene. And this is relatively cheap in terms of resources if you use a portable vision mixer, and it encourages the screen actor to consider collaborative elements of the production process and allow that to subtly influence their performance. Thank you very much.